Order. We now come to this statement on measures to tackle domestic abuse and hidden harms during lockdown. I call Minister Victoria Atkins to give us her statement.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And with your permission, I would like to make a statement. The coronavirus pandemic has presented this country with enormous and unprecedented challenges. In order to control the spread of the virus, we have had to ask the public to follow a simple but crucial instruction: stay at home. Earlier this month, we entered a new national lockdown. And while we are absolutely clear that these measures are necessary, it is also important to recognise the potential impact on what we refer to as hidden harm crimes. These include domestic abuse, child sexual exploitation and modern slavery. These are some of the most pernicious, harmful types of offending in society, and they often occur behind closed doors. Given this fact, let me reiterate a crucial message that the Prime Minister delivered to the public last week. Notwithstanding the restrictions in place, those at risk of abuse can leave home to seek safety and avoid the risk of harm. Protecting those at risk of abuse and exploitation remains a priority for this government, which is why I'm so pleased that today I'm able to announce the launch of a new code word scheme for victims of domestic abuse called Ask for Annie. From today, thousands of pharmacies across the UK will provide this service, enabling victims to seek help discreetly. Through a signal to a pharmacist, a victim will be provided with a safe space in the pharmacy and taken through the support available to them, whether that is a call to the police or a domestic abuse helpline service. The code word scheme will offer a vital lifeline to all victims, ensuring they get help in a safe and discreet way. I would like now to set out more of the steps we have taken to ensure that victims and those at risk can continue to access critical advice and support. In terms of funding, we have provided unprecedented levels of additional funding to critical frontline services helping victims of domestic abuse. As part of wider charitable funding, the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice and MHCLG have between them distributed more than £25 million in emergency COVID-19 funding for domestic abuse organisations. This has provided almost 1,900 bed spaces in safe accommodation and has enabled domestic abuse organisations of all sizes to provide advice and support to victims. For example, Home Office funding allowed the charity Safe Lives to train hundreds of frontline workers online, including new independent domestic violence advisors. To help sustain these charities through the second part of the year, we are providing further funding of nearly £11 million from both the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office. While funding forms an important strand of our response, it is also vital that victims of domestic abuse and those worried about them know how to access help and advice. In April, the Home Secretary launched the #YouAreNotAlone communications campaign to do precisely that. The campaign has reached almost 25 million people through paid advertising and has been supported by a range of celebrities and influencers who have shared its messages to more than 130 million followers on social media. Materials have been translated into 16 languages. The campaign directs victims to sources of specialist help and support. It also makes clear that the stay-at-home restrictions do not apply to those at risk of abuse who need to leave home to seek help or refuge. We have relaunched the campaign over the winter to reaffirm these messages, and I ask all honourable members across the House to do everything they can, please, to highlight the campaign and to make clear to victims that help continues to be at hand should they need it. The police have been and will continue to be proactive in tackling domestic abuse during this period. Courts have continued to prioritise domestic and child abuse cases throughout, as well as civil protection orders relating to domestic abuse, stalking, forced marriage and female genital mutilation. We have seen many innovative police responses to domestic abuse during the pandemic. The Metropolitan Police has developed an online function for the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, whereby police can disclose previous domestic violence history to new partners, and Nottinghamshire Police are applying the disclosure scheme in every domestic abuse occurrence. Other forces are able to use discrete technology to take witness statements remotely without leaving any trace on the victim's phone, and some forces, such as Gloucestershire, have used spare capacity to instigate dedicated domestic violence response vehicles, while independent domestic violence advisors are, of course, helping to support victims. But there are, sadly, other forms of hidden harms than domestic abuse. We are also acutely aware that the pandemic has increased risks to some children and young people and has reduced their contact with trusted professionals and trusted adults. The government is committed to doing everything we can to continue to support and protect children at risk, and has provided over £11 million since last June to Barnardo's See, Hear, Respond service to support more than 50,000 vulnerable or hidden children whose usual support networks have been affected by national and local pandemic restrictions. The Home Office has also launched a national communications campaign called Something's Not Right to help children who have been exposed to a range of harms, reaching millions of secondary school children in England. At this time, we are particularly concerned about online harms. With children spending more time on the internet, parents have been signposted to materials for staying safe online, including from the National Crime Agency's Think You Know campaign. A record number of reports of online child sexual abuse have been processed by the UK's Internet Watch Foundation, including a large increase in self-generated indecent images of children. The Home Office is providing £80,000 to support the development of the IWF's campaign to support parents in starting conversations with their children around keeping safe online, and to help young people to identify the signs of coercion and to report abuse. And in December, we published the full government response to the Online Harms White Paper, which sets out our expectations on companies to keep their users safe, especially children. At the same time, we published the Interim Code of Practice on online child sexual exploitation and abuse, which sets out steps that companies can take now to tackle these crimes on a voluntary basis ahead of any regulatory system being introduced. Another form of hidden harm is modern slavery, and the government is committed to the safety and security of victims of modern slavery, particularly during the pandemic, by ensuring that victims are provided with the support they need and that those responsible for these crimes are prosecuted. Last year, we made an additional £1.73 million available for modern slavery services in England and Wales. The funding has enabled providers to adapt the ways in which they provide support during the pandemic, including reducing face-to-face contact where appropriate and ensuring that support can be accessed remotely. And the new victim care contract came into force last week and will help to ensure that victims receive the care they need. In early adopter sites, child victims of modern slavery continue to be supported by the Independent Child Trafficking Guardian Scheme that is working flexibly to continue to provide effective and responsive support remotely, both to trafficked children directly and to other professionals. And law enforcement agencies continue to pursue high-risk modern slavery cases where there is a risk of harm or detriment to individuals. Throughout the coronavirus pandemic, we have remained resolute in our commitment to tackling abuse that takes place behind closed doors, out of sight. We continue to work across government to monitor, assess and respond to the ongoing situation. But I ask all honourable members to consider ways in which they can point victims in their constituencies to support. We will continue to prioritise domestic abuse during and after the pandemic. To do this, we remain committed to delivering our landmark domestic abuse bill to further strengthen protections for victims and bring perpetrators to justice. In addition, this year, we will publish the new Tackling Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which will help us to better target perpetrators and support victims of these abhorrent crimes. We are currently running a call for evidence to inform the new strategy, and I urge honourable members to share this via their networks within their constituencies to help us reach as wide an audience as possible. This will be followed by a dedicated and complementary domestic abuse strategy that will ensure progress following the passage of the landmark domestic abuse bill. And we will soon publish the first of its kind strategy on tackling all forms of child sexual abuse, outlining our long-term ambition to drive a whole system response in tackling this heinous crime. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to thank everyone involved in helping victims of hidden crimes in this pandemic and beyond. From those working in domestic abuse refuges and community services and in modern slavery, safe accommodation, to those scouring the internet to remove images of children being raped, as well as our police officers, our National Crime Agency officers, our Border Force officers, and those working in the security services to support this work. Thank you for all you are doing to help support victims and to stop perpetrators of these terrible crimes. And I would like to finish by reassuring all victims of hidden harms that they are not alone, their voices are heard, and help will continue to be there for them. I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you. Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for advance sight of her statement. We in the Labour Party are really pleased to hear about the launch of the Ask for Annie scheme today. This will be a real innovation in helping victims come forward. Can the Minister tell the House what work her department have done to ensure that on launching this brilliant scheme, that when a victim comes forward, there will be support beyond an initial phone call available, especially in cases where victims are not ready to inform the police? We are now 8 days into a third national lockdown, with a stay-at-home message that we've all become incredibly familiar with. It was welcome in this, the third lockdown, that the Prime Minister clarified that individuals who wish to leave their homes to escape domestic abuse could do so. This message was not given back in March, and I welcome that this has been rectified and that the right thing has now been said. We on these benches welcome what the Minister has said today about the measures that have been taken to tackle domestic abuse and hidden harms. Back in April, my honourable friend, the Shadow Home Secretary, wrote to the Home Secretary, urging her to act on this important issue. He also raised concerns from the sector, including the need to urgently bring forward a package of emergency financial support for organisations who are doing the vital work that the Minister talks about on the front line. It was the Labour Party who urged the government to put in place a £75 million financial support for the sector. When the government announced that they would do this, we welcome this support. However, the Home Secretary confirmed back in June, months into the crisis, that only a staggering 1.2 million had been spent. And today, the Minister's statement tells us that now 11 months into this crisis, still only a third of that funding has reached the front line. Can the Honourable Lady explain this? Can she tell us when the 51 million unspent will be allocated? Can she also confirm that the 11 million extra that she has announced today is in excess of the 76 million already announced? The Minister has also mentioned refuge capacity, and we thank all of those who struggled very hard under very difficult circumstances to create urgently needed beds that should never have been missing. We must now ask, is there still enough? I have myself this week tried to get a refuge bed and not been able to find one. So will the Minister tell us what contact she has had with refugees about capacity today and in the coming weeks? Can she today say that she is confident that there is capacity to meet the demand? Can the Minister tell the House what specific provisions have been made for specialised services for those victims who are BAME, migrant, LGBTQ, male and disabled? As the Minister has mentioned, children are often the hidden victims of domestic and sexual abuse in the home. So can she tell us what work her department is doing to ensure that vulnerable children who are out of school are safe? What, if any, detached youth work and proactive targeting of children, at the very least those on child protection plans, has she asked for in order to reach children living in dangerous and violent homes? She mentions the £11 million fund to the brilliant See Here Respond scheme. But as she said herself, this will target 50,000 children, not the 750,000 children today living in dangerous homes. Can she tell us if any of the schemes that she has announced for children cover every child in our country and that all child victims can benefit, not just those in some areas where a postcode lottery determines if we fund a child's safety? To continue on a theme, the Minister mentions the support of independent child trafficking guardians, a brilliant scheme that we will welcome. Can she confirm that this scheme is available to all children trafficked in our country, as was promised some years ago by this government? Or is it still, as I understand, just a pilot for some areas, leaving some trafficked children without support? Domestic abuse and community support services are currently planning for redundancies in March. Quite unbelievable in the middle of a global pandemic and a national lockdown. The sector, the Labour Party, the Domestic Abuse and the Victims Commissioner have all called repeatedly for sustainable funding for at least the next year. The staff being made redundant are the very people the Minister needs for Ask for Annie to have any chance of success. Can the Minister confirm if there has been any discussions with the sector or with the Treasury about multi-year funding and an end to the dangerous year-on-year short-termism in community services for adults and children? The government were too slow to act in the first and the second lockdown. I am very pleased today that now in the third lockdown, they are more alert to this issue. Labour, the Shadow Home Secretary and myself have been saying to the government since April that they need to do more to protect those who cannot leave home. It is not just enough to say that victims should reach out. We in this House, especially the government, have a responsibility to make sure that when they do, there is help for them. If there isn't, we risk losing them for good. With the thought of the lockdown carrying on until March, it is imperative that the government act and act fast. All members across this House need to assure their constituents that all of those, not just some victims suffering domestic abuse and other hidden harms, can leave and can access safety. There are people waiting and willing to help is the message we need to send, and it is on all of us to make sure that that is the case. Thank you.
Order. Just before I call the Minister, I must point out that the Honourable Lady has significantly exceeded the time allocated to her. I know this is a very serious subject, but everybody on this list recognises it's a serious subject, and they will all want to make points, and I must ask for brief questions. If there aren't brief questions, then the people who are at the end of the list, who everyone can see who they are, will not get to ask their questions, and it's a matter of dividing the time in this House equally and fairly between one member and another. Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for that. And accordingly, what I will do, I will answer some of the Honourable Lady's issues, and then I'll write to her on those matters that I can't address, because I am mindful, as the Madam Deputy Speaker, you say, regarding other colleagues who would like to come in. May I deal first of all with the code word scheme? I really welcome the fact that the Honourable Lady and the opposition welcome this scheme. It's been really, really carefully thought through, really careful working with domestic abuse charities, including Hestia, who've done great work with their own Safe Spaces scheme. And we're absolutely clear this scheme must be victim-led. In other words, when a victim is taken into the consultation room in pharmacies, they will be asked by a fully trained pharmacist what they would like to do. For some, it may be a 999 call, but equally for others, it may well be other forms of help through the helplines and community services. And we're going to look after this very, very carefully to ensure that it is working well for victims. It is another way, another source of information and access to help for victims, because we're so aware of how difficult it can be for victims to reach out. She challenged me on the funding. She will know we've had this conversation before, but I can say that the latest figures I have to hand on the funding that we have committed, both from the charitable funding that was committed in spring last year, as well as the Home Office's additional £2 million fund for the helpline services and web-based services, a total of just under £27 million has been allocated and indeed paid out of government coffers. That's across MHCLG, MOJ and Home Office. In relation to the £11 million, we are working hard to allocate that, but as I say, that was in addition to this funding, which of course is in addition to the funding that is available in normal times. I'm really pleased that with refugees, part of the funding that has been granted through the Chancellor's charitable funding that was announced in spring, that has allowed just under a further 1,900 spaces in safe accommodation. That we clearly keep that under review, and we want to get to a space where the sorts of challenges she has set out do not apply. That is precisely why we're bringing in the duty through the Domestic Abuse Bill on Tier 1 local authorities, and she will know that MHCLG has already provided funding ahead of the next financial year to help Tier 1 local authorities prepare for that. In terms of vulnerable children, we have, there are many things we've done, but we have in particular very much worked with social care services and early help services to ensure that they continue to support vulnerable children and young people with their families. I've seen this myself, not just in the context of CSEA, but also in the context of, for example, gang exploitation. We have also brought thousands of social workers back onto a temporary register, the Social Work Together online tool, which we've developed in partnership with Social Work England and the Local Government Association to try to draw on their expertise and experience where needed. And of course, we have invested not just in the See Hear Respond service that she supports, but also the NSPCC helplines, Childline and the equivalent for adults. And then finally, in terms of ICTIGs, which are the trafficking guardians that are rolled out, that has been rolled out over a third of local authorities. Again, we have been clear that we want to roll this out further. She will know that the model of use of the NRM by child victims has changed in recent years with the sad arrival of county line gangs, and so we have been changing the system to try to reflect the needs of those victims as well as victims from overseas. But this is all work that is continuing through this pandemic, and I thank her for joining our call to ensure that these messages are rolled out across our constituencies to help our victims wherever they may live.
Thank you. Dame Cheryl Gillen.
Madam Deputy Speaker, both you and I have worked on this important policy area in the past, and I want to commend the Minister for her statement today and the added protections that she's putting in place. But evidence is now becoming available that some of the people who are suffering most adversely in this lockdown are adults and children with autism. So that more appropriate and better services can be offered to them to alleviate their suffering, what data is the government collecting on individuals and families with an autistic member suffering from domestic abuse and the hidden harms she has referred to during this lockdown? If the answer is none, can this be remedied immediately? If it is being collected, can it be published on a regular basis so specialised support can be improved to this vulnerable group of adults and children?
Well, may I thank my right honourable friend, and she's absolutely right to raise, as indeed she always takes the opportunity when it presents itself, to raise the needs of people living with autism and other such conditions. I hope that she welcomes the mental health reforms that the government has announced this week, which will be, I hope, a real step forward in us all understanding the differences between autism and Asperger's and the ways in which they are wrongly treated under the historic legislation at this point in time. And I hope also she's aware of the national strategy for disabled people, which the Prime Minister is absolutely committed to publishing. Only yesterday, in fact, or the day before, I attended a meeting chaired by my honourable friend for North Swindon, whereby we were working out across government how we can help people with disabilities, including, I should say, those who live with autism. As to the specific points on data, sadly, the collection of data in respect of victims, there is much room for improvement. What I would do is take away her specific question, because I am very clear in my mind as to how those health conditions can make a person more vulnerable to exploitation and to abuse. And it would be, as part of our work, to ensure that disabled victims of domestic abuse are better looked after. I would very much, if I may, draw upon her advice and wisdom in this respect, because we want to be clear that no matter what health conditions and disabilities people are living with, they should not be victims of these terrible, terrible crimes.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Abusers exploit lockdowns to increase their control. So I welcome the Ask for Annie scheme. It's something the Select Committee has called for. But on the vital issue of services funding, can she explain, is the 11 million she announced the same 11 million that was announced for the second lockdown, or is there any additional funding for this difficult third lockdown? And when the Domestic Abuse Commissioner has called for funding to be extended beyond March, is it being?
I thank, of course, the Right Honourable Lady and the work her committee does to scrutinise rightly the work of government in this regard. The £11 million, I hope I was clear, was the £11 million that was announced in November, and that was very much directed towards helping organisations for the rest of the financial year. And so we are working very, very closely with domestic abuse services to understand the strains they are facing. I know from speaking to chief execs of the charities that, like a lot of frontline services, frontline workers are just feeling exhausted by having to work in these conditions and with the extra pressures that they have faced over recent months, forgive me. But this money is taking us up to the end of this financial year. In relation to domestic abuse services beyond the end of this financial year, she will know we've just had the spending review process. We are in the middle of working out allocations, but I do hope she draws some comfort, as I said to her honourable friend earlier, that MHCLG has already committed £6 million to helping Tier 1 local authorities prepare for that really important duty that is set out in the bill to help victims who are in safe accommodation.
Andrea Ledson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know my honourable friend is aware that lockdown has been so challenging to new families with small babies, and in certain tragic cases, it has been deadly to those babies and toddlers. The Early Years Healthy Development Review that I'm chairing on behalf of the government has heard about the effect that lockdown has had on our very youngest. And I'd like to ask my honourable friend what steps she's taking to protect the youngest in our society from the effects of domestic violence.
Well, may I thank my right honourable friend for the really amazing work she is doing in this regard. It has long been a passion of hers, and I look forward to her drawing her conclusions in due course on this vital piece of work. We are very conscious of the pressures on children in abusive households, including preschool children. And that is why we have provided £3 million to support children affected by domestic abuse, and indeed corresponding work on the development of perpetrator programmes. But we are very, very aware of the need, as she says sadly, to look after the youngest babies and children because of some of the figures that came out of the last full lockdown. And this is why our work, her work and our work to continue to tackle these terrible crimes is so vital, not least because of course seeing this abuse in young age can have terrible effects for the children's long-term life chances as well.
Ellie Reeves.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Between April and November last year, referrals from the NSPCC to police and social services about child abuse increased by 79%. Schools play an important role in identifying potential abuse, so with the current lockdown, this is likely to be harder to pick up on. So with local authorities already facing considerable financial pressures, what extra resources will the government be giving to them to help detect and prevent child abuse during this lockdown?
Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right to highlight the enormous work that schools are doing during lockdown restrictions, as well as the period we had last year between lockdown restrictions. And we have invested some £8 million to help teachers spot some of the signs of abuse and of distress in children. It may take some time for those signs to show themselves when children return to the classroom, but that money is intended to help address that. She will also, I hope, have heard of the investment we have made in the See Here Respond scheme, and we have provided £7.6 million to children's charities who have suffered financial hardship due to COVID-19, and we continue to fund Childline itself, as well as I say, the professional helpline for adults who are concerned about a child. And if I may as well, in addition to this, we are funding a helpline that Operation Encompass has set up, which in the middle of the last national lockdown, last year, in which it's a helpline for teachers who are perhaps receiving into school or are aware of families in their schools they're worried about, in particular relation to domestic abuse, and what they can do to help. And that Operation Encompass helpline is very much there to help the teachers who are helping to look after our children, and I recommend it to any teachers in her constituency and elsewhere.
David Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I warmly welcome the launch of this new code word scheme today. I have a constituent whose abusive partner is subjected to a non-molestation order, but because the place that she lives is also the place that they both had a joint business together, he's managed to get the zonal aspect of this order lifted on the grounds he needs to be in the location for business. The abuse has restarted, and because it's lockdown, it's very difficult for her friends and family to be able to support her in the right way. So will my honourable friend meet with me so we can discuss how better support can be given to victims of abuse in these circumstances?
I most certainly will meet my honourable friend. I thank him for raising a case that demonstrates the complexity of many, many people's experiences of abuse, even after a relationship has ended. There are a number of measures we're taking in the bill to try to address this sort of abusive behaviour, including the introduction of domestic abuse protection orders, which will put positive requirements on offenders as well as negative requirements. But very, very happy to meet him, and I very much hope that through his work, but also I hope through support of services, I do hope that his constituent is able to find a solution to the terrible situation he has described.
Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's an awful lot to commend in the Minister's statement this morning, in particular the Ask Annie scheme. But can I put it to the Minister that what's really important is that early detection of abuse and abusive behaviour is most likely to lead to behaviour change by the perpetrator, and which is why it's so important, particularly during lockdown, that victims are at least given credibility and that there is early action to support those victims and to work with perpetrators to break that cycle. That's vital during COVID as during normal times.
I do. May I say it's a pleasure to see the Honourable Gentleman again. He's absolutely right. This is not just about supporting victims. We absolutely want to deal with perpetrators' behaviour as well and to stop the cycle of abuse. And that is why, in addition to all the work we're doing with the pandemic this year, we are also investing £7.1 million into perpetrator programmes because we want to tackle that offending behaviour. And may I also raise the existence of a helpline, the Respect helpline, which can help people who are worried about the way they are beginning to behave. The number is on the gov.uk website, and sadly it has seen an increase in calls during the pandemic, but there is help there for people who want it, who are worried about their own behaviour as well, to stop a situation spiralling, as the Honourable Gentleman has described so eloquently.
Deanna Davison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm really grateful to the Minister for implementing the Ask Annie scheme, which will be a vital lifeline for victims of domestic abuse. But another lifeline is the availability of domestic abuse refuges, such as Wear Valley Women's Aid in Bishop Auckland. Paula from the organisation wrote to me this week, concerned that if COVID spread throughout their team, they may be unable to continue to provide their much needed service. So on this note, can my honourable friend assure Paula and myself that those providing domestic abuse refuge services will be considered for the priority list in the next phase of the vaccine rollout to help ensure that there are no gaps in support for domestic abuse victims because of COVID?
Thank you to my honourable friend for raising this really important point. We know that the Joint Committee, who is currently advising the government on the ways in which the vaccination programme should be rolled out, they have focused on the highest clinical need priority groups, which include, of course, residents in care homes and healthcare workers. And once that phase is completed, we hope and expect by mid-February, then we will be looking at the next rollout phase. And she will know that there are many categories of professions, including, of course, refuge charities, but also police officers, teachers and others, where great arguments will be made as to their exposure to the public and to the risk of infection. So I've very much taken her urging on board, and we will, I'm sure, in due course, consider her points and others in this regard.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the chair of the Appg for the prevention of adverse childhood experiences, I'm incredibly worried about the long-term consequences for a large number of children that COVID and the increase in domestic abuse has. There will be no short-term fixes. Will the Minister work with the Appg to embed widespread trauma-informed services across the country?
Yes, I most certainly will, and as again I refer the House back to the contribution made by my right honourable friend who is already preparing work on the effects of adverse consequences in the early years of a child's life. But I think our understanding is improving as to what, for example, living in an abusive household, what effect that can have on a child's life chances. And indeed, in my work on tackling serious violence, we're very clear as to the themes of violence in the home being very, very common for those who commit violence outside of the home. So there are many, many reasons why this work is really invaluable, and I very much look forward to working with the Honourable Lady and the Appg in this regard.
Robert Halfon.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend will be aware that organisations like the Safeguarding Alliance have reported there's a new frontier of vulnerable children exposed to county line drug gangs, online harms and domestic abuse. And we know the BBC found reports of online child abuse images increased by 50% during the last lockdown. Further to this, many children on the fringes of care are often not attending school during this lockdown, even if permitted to do so. So will she ensure these children are identified by schools and checked by social services? And just to set out what measures the government's taking to ensure we don't have a safeguarding crisis in the offing for these young children. And finally, will she meet with the Safeguarding Alliance to discuss these issues?
Yes, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for his, my Right Honourable Friend I should say, for his question, all the work he does on his committee to scrutinise our work in this. We are all, I think, concerned about the welfare of the most vulnerable children. It's why, for example, in the first lockdown, we enabled vulnerable children to still attend school, very much sending out the message to parents, to carers and to children and young people themselves that if they need that extra bit of help and support, the schools are open to give them that access to that support. And of course that continues to today's restrictions because schools are open to vulnerable children as well. In terms of the work that we're doing over and above keeping schools open, I've already referred to the vital work that social workers are conducting and our efforts to increase the number of social workers available to help with this work. Some of our children's charities have also been fantastic in this regard. I've seen for myself, as I say, some of the work that Bernardo's and the Children's Society, for example, are doing to help children, particularly those children who are being ensnared potentially by county line gangs. But this comes back to how we can reach those children before those gangs really get their fists on these poor children. And it is a combination of education at school. It's a combination of having education and support for families as well, because often mums and dads and carers can be very worried about their child. And it's about ensuring that we have really robust law enforcement measures in place with those gangs. One of the things that the police were able to do during the last national lockdown, the first one, was to really up their game in terms of, or really concentrate on targeting drug gangs, and we are really seeing some of the results of that work alongside the safeguarding and the early intervention work we are doing.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Diolch, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Minister for her update today and fully welcome the new Ask for Annie scheme. Residents in Pontypridd who have experienced domestic abuse will appreciate the issue being raised here today. As my honourable friend, the member for Rochdale, has already said, tackling the root cause of domestic abuse requires a long-term strategy focused on interventions targeted towards the perpetrators. Can the Minister therefore confirm exactly what support and conversations the Home Office is having with organisations working in this area?
Well, I'm so pleased the Honourable Lady raised the point about a strategy. She will know, I hope, that alongside our work on the domestic abuse bill, indeed she served on the bill committee that is currently in the House of Lords at the moment, we are also planning for a standalone specific national strategy on domestic abuse. And within that strategy, I very much expect there to be measures in relation to perpetrators, because whilst we of course want to support victims, it is vital that we tackle the cycle of abuse as well. And so that strategy, combined with our investment of £7.1 million into perpetrator programmes, will really, I hope, revolutionise our approach in this important regard to tackling domestic abuse.
Faye Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last year, the government prioritised the Domestic Abuse Bill Committee so that the bill's progress was not disrupted by the pandemic. This speaks to both the determination of the government and the personal determination of the Safeguarding Minister, and the Ask for Annie scheme is evidence of that. But the scourge of cyber flashing, where unwanted and unsolicited indecent photographs are distributed to mobile devices, needs to be made a criminal offence. Can my right honourable friend confirm the government is considering this?
Well, may I thank my honourable friend. It was a pleasure to serve on the Bill Committee with her, and I know her personal commitment to helping her constituents in this regard. I'm pleased again that she's brought up that aspect, because it enables me to reiterate to honourable members that we are running a call for evidence at the moment on producing a new violence against women and girls strategy. And I don't want to pre-guess what the public and victims and survivors and charities may respond or may say in the course of that call for evidence. But I, for one, am very, very aware of the offence about which she speaks, and I very much want those sorts of 21st century online crimes to be dealt with, not just in the VORG strategy, but also in the DA strategy, and indeed making sure that our laws are up to date, as we have asked the Law Commission to ensure. So I thank her for her question and encourage her to publicise the call for evidence with her constituents. Thank you.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her statement. The Prime Minister indicated to the Liaison Committee yesterday that the government does not have any specific policies in place for survivors of domestic abuse for what the Home Office describes as those with insecure immigration status. So can the Minister confirm that's the case, and will she look at additional protections for those who are seeking refuge in the United Kingdom?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I can help the Honourable Gentleman with news of a specific pilot project that we have launched the bidding process for just before Christmas to help support migrant victims of domestic abuse. He will know that there is already support available for some migrant victims, namely those who have a legitimate expectation of indefinite leave to remain because they come to this country on a spousal visa and they are eligible under the domestic violence concession scheme. But we are very conscious there is a cohort of victims who do not fall within that criteria. And so this pilot scheme has been created very much in consultation with specialist charities who help such victims, and we're in the middle of the bid process. I'm very much hoping we'll be able to make some progress in the next couple of months so that we can help those victims, first and foremost as victims of domestic abuse, and ensure that their abusers cannot continue their abuse.
Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I ask my honourable friend what specific measures she is taking to reach out to domestic abuse victims in the BAME community who might find it harder to communicate and let others know of the plight that they face?
I thank my right honourable friend sincerely. Yes, we know that the plight of victims in the BAME community and other similar situations may find it very difficult to reach out. So the Home Office works very, very closely with specialist organisations, specialist charitable organisations. I myself have the pleasure of working with them as well to make sure that the policies we are introducing will help the whole realm of problems and issues and abuse that victims face. And I very much thank my honourable friend, right honourable friend, for her help in ensuring that the committee scrutinises our work.
Apsana Begum.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Running away from home, wanting a divorce, wanting to marry and saying no to marriage. These are some of the scenarios victims of abuse have contacted the charity Karma Nirvana about since the lockdown. Lockdowns and this crisis have produced the economic conditions to increase forced marriage, no doubt among families already struggling with food and financial hardship in particular. Will the Minister work with her counterparts leading the Department for Education and the Department for Work and Pensions to deliver a plan to tackle forced marriages in lockdown, which provides sufficient economic protection to households so that they are not choosing between their children marrying or going hungry? Thank you.
The Honourable Lady sets out one of the most heinous forms of hidden harms. I hope she knows of the work we have done to tackle forced marriage, both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. Certainly, I always enjoy working with Carmen Nirvana on this, and I'm conscious of time. So if I may, I'm going to write to the Honourable Lady with the specific steps that we're taking to help victims of forced marriage.
Laura Trott.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her statement and all her work in this area. The Minister referred earlier to the helpline element of Operation Encompass. There is another part of this initiative whereby police automatically inform schools where a domestic violence incident has occurred in a child's home. This has been tragically absolutely vital in my constituency, and I think it should be available nationwide. Will the Minister confirm whether the police element of Operation Encompass will be available on a nationwide basis?
I'm delighted to be able to confirm that not only does my honourable friend's force, Kent, signed up to that fantastic scheme, so too are 40 other forces out of the 43 police forces in England and Wales. This is a great scheme. I would encourage the remaining forces to sign up because that we have seen the evidence that helping children on the morning of their return to school after a terrible incident at Hope the night before can pay dividends in terms of their well-being.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome today's announcement of the Ask Annie scheme. The Minister will be aware that legal aid is a vital service for victims of domestic abuse. To access this service, victims will quite often need a letter from a GP to prove their injuries are a result of abuse. Reports of GPs charging up to £150 for a letter to do this are a disgrace. So will the government today commit to ensuring this appalling practice ends?
The practice she describes, we have already, in years gone by, agreed with the BMA that this practice is not within their recommendations. They have made that clear to their members. I know it's been raised in the other House. And we continue to look into it. If I may just clarify a tiny point, my right honourable friend, the Lord President, answered a question on this earlier and referred to considerations within the bill, the domestic abuse bill, which of course is in the other place. Just to clarify, that was there was a problem of translation through masks, but we look at legal aid in the context. It's always something that we consider, but within the bill itself, we are looking very specifically at the measures available in courts to help victims of domestic abuse.
Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a very welcome statement and initiative. The Minister has referred to the priority that is rightly being given by the police and the criminal courts to bringing perpetrators before them swiftly and promptly where there is evidence to support it. But will she also set out what steps the government is taking to ensure that victims have swift access to legal advice as to their right and redress in the family and civil courts without the need to go through complicated legal aid application forms?
I hope I caught most of my right honourable friend's question there. He will know of the sterling work being done by my ministerial counterpart in the Ministry of Justice to ensure that victims of domestic abuse can have access to free legal advice in the initial stages of their case. The scheme is called Flows. I really recommend it because it has a huge benefit for people who are in the early stages of the court process, but also, of course, courts remain open during these restrictions. They have remained open for domestic abuse and other vulnerabilities, but other priority cases. And we would encourage anyone who needs to access court to please continue trying to do so during this current set of restrictions.
Order. The Honourable Gentleman for Bromley and Chislehurst was very brief in his question, but I must beg that we go a lot faster now. Otherwise, not everybody will get to ask their question. And it's also not fair on people who are waiting to take part in the next 3 items of business. So questions and answers have to be short. Farrell Clark.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We know the terrifying impact of lockdowns on those experiencing domestic abuse and the increased pressure on support services and refugees. What discussions has the Minister had with charities and organisations running refuges for women, men and those of the LGBT plus community about capacity, and what plans are there to ensure that rising demands does not mean that some people are left with a choice between staying with their abuser or homelessness?
Well, as I've responded earlier, I'm in constant contact, as are my people who work within the domestic abuse sector and provide refuges. MHCLG has provided advance funding ahead of the duty under the Domestic Abuse Bill coming into force, we hope, in April, May. And we very much want to keep building this capability so that people have access to the services she sets out.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Research by Women's Aid has found that COVID-19 restrictions and associated socio-economic strains make leaving abusive relationships more difficult, and their data also indicate that separations are being delayed until restrictions are eased rather than cancelled. So although the funding and support announced today is welcome, since separation is a known trigger for domestic abuse escalation, what is the government planning to put in place to anticipate this likely surge in demand?
We have been working closely with domestic abuse charities throughout the pandemic to ensure that when surge happens, as sadly is predicted, that services are there to be able to deal with it. It's why we've committed the extra funding that I've already outlined earlier in the statement, and we're very much looking to the future, as I say, through the Domestic Abuse Bill and the continued duty on Tier 1 local authorities to help people in safe accommodation.
Peter Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I congratulate my honourable friend on her announcement today, yet another positive step from this government on tackling domestic abuse. My honourable friend is aware that victims of this heinous crime require help and support of many organisations, just like Family Help in Darlington. Can I ask my honourable friend to outline to the House how the government is getting its financial support to these organisations as quickly as possible?
May I thank my honourable friend, who was a sterling performer in the Bill Committee of the bill. We have taken a national, regional and local approach to community-based services, and we have very much rolled out the community-based service funding with the help of police and crime commissioners to both commissioned and non-commissioned services. And of course, MHCLG has been rolling out money to refuges. We in the Home Office have been focusing on the national, regional parts of this funding, including helping to bolster the helplines, which we know so many people are relying on to seek help from their abuse.
Jim Shannon.
Can I thank the Minister for her statement today? 567 domestic case abuse calls in March, last week of March of this year, 8,302 in April to June. So would the Minister please confirm that the supports that are, the helps that are intended to bring in today will also be emulated in Northern Ireland, and that discussion has taken place with the Minister in charge in the Northern Assembly to ensure that this is the case?
I'm delighted to confirm that my opposite number in the Northern Ireland Executive is working hard and has confirmed her intention to bring in similar legislation into Northern Ireland. This, in fact, is a vital part of our jigsaw in terms of ratifying the Istanbul Convention. So we're wishing her well and the Assembly well in their scrutiny of the forthcoming legislation.
Jane Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To those trapped in abusive relationships, getting out can seem like an impossible task. Can my right honourable friend give reassurance that if they seek help through Ask for Annie, they'll be connected to an amazing network of help, such as the Haven in Wolverhampton? The Minister also mentioned modern slavery and human trafficking. Can victims of these hidden harms also seek emergency help through the Ask for Annie pharmacy scheme?
Thank you. With the Ask for Annie scheme, it is at the moment focused on victims of domestic abuse. There's been a huge and very careful training programme of the pharmacists who are currently participating. Nearly 8,000 members of staff have been trained in Boots alone, and they will be very, very knowledgeable as to what to do when somebody walks into their chemist seeking help. In terms of the access to help, she's absolutely right that sometimes just getting out of the house is a huge obstacle, which is why I'm delighted also that we are funding a rail to refuge scheme to help victims make that railway journey to a refuge space as and when they need it.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Sadly, 1,500 children in York are growing up in a home where domestic abuse is a factor, according to the Office of the Children's Commissioner. Will the Minister give clear assurances today that victims can have the confidence that if they ask for Annie, that they will be provided with more than a conversation, but the safeguarded housing, well-being and psychological help for them and their children?
Well, the Honourable Lady, I hope, knows that the training of members of staff has been meticulous. We have created this scheme hand in glove with domestic abuse charities because we have been so concerned to ensure the safety of victims. I see this as the first avenue of support, and once the victim is in the consultation room, then she or he can set out what they would like to happen. For some, it will be a 999 call. For others, it will be access to community services. But I hope she has got a picture now of the tapestry of support that we are rolling out at local level to try to help victims of domestic abuse.
Flip Drummond.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Online image-based sexual abuse is an increasing way that perpetrators coerce and control their victims by threatening to release private, intimate videos and photographs online. According to the Revenge Porn Helpline, the number of people contacting them has risen to over 3,000, a 22% increase during 2020. Has the Minister considered the impact of this during lockdown, and will she agree to include the threat of releasing these intimate and private images as a crime in the domestic abuse bill?
My honourable friend is quite right that this can be a devastating form of abuse for victims of domestic abuse, and we are very much listening to the debates in the other place as to the terrible factors in this type of behaviour. I hope she knows that we have already asked the Law Commission to look into the many forms of malicious behaviour that can occur online. This is something I know that they're considering, and we're very, very much looking forward to receiving the outcome of that review to see what may be needed in the future.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We know that when it comes to domestic abuse, every contact counts, and the government's new Ask for Annie scheme is very welcome step towards enabling victims of domestic abuse to receive the support they need. However, we do need to do more. Will the Minister look again at including a statutory duty on public authorities to train frontline staff to recognise the signs of domestic abuse and to fund such training?
Well, I hope the Honourable Lady has seen the announcement, not just of the code word scheme today, but also the announcement encouraging employers to join the cause and to be better informed as to how they can help members of their workforce who may be suffering from domestic abuse. My honourable friend, the Business Minister, has written to many businesses today to set out how they can help, and I see this as very much part of our overall efforts to ensure that people understand what domestic abuse is, the many forms it can take, and how it is everyone's business.
We have exceeded the time, considerably exceeded the time allocated for this statement, but I don't think it would be fair to cut off the last three people who are on the list. But I'm saying now, not only to people who have taken part in this statement, but to all members, if anyone's paying attention, that if we're going to make virtual proceedings work, we have to do it as if we were in the chamber. That means we do it quickly. It's not a conversation, it's questions and answers. Now, we really have to go quickly, and I say the same for the next statement, because it's not fair for the people who will be here at 5 o'clock who simply won't get to speak. Joe Gideon.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Due to the emergency circumstances, victims of domestic abuse sometimes have to flee, leaving behind all their possessions, including mobile phones, making it harder to stay in contact with the police and other agencies. In Stoke-on-Trent, the police have launched a fantastic initiative whereby some vulnerable residents and domestic abuse victims have been given mobile phones loaded with useful contacts based on the individual situation. Does the Minister agree that it is important to support measures enabling domestic abuse victims to leave their home environment by eradicating the fear of being cut off from society, especially when COVID-19 is exacerbating isolation in every form?
Thank you to my honourable friend. We are very keen not just to help victims flee home when that is necessary for their own safety, but also importantly to keep them in their own homes where it is safe to do so, and to ask the perpetrator or demand that the perpetrator leaves. There's a whole host of work going on this. I very much perhaps will take up the opportunity to discuss it in slower time with her outside of this statement, but I thank her.
Tamanjit Singh Desai.
Thank you very much. Madam Deputy Speaker, many of us have been extremely concerned about the increased incidence of domestic abuse and other hidden harms during lockdown. However, many domestic abuse charities, anti-modern slavery and vulnerable children's organisations have been struggling financially and spoken about the insufficient support from government. So can the Minister confirm what discussions has she had with the Treasury and the sector on multi-year funding?
I refer the honourable gentleman to the answers I have given previously, including answers in relation to the £26 million that has already been paid out to charities.
Julie Marston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and for getting to me at the end of this list. I would like to thank the Minister for her statement and all her work on this issue, and I would like to commend to her the work of Future Living in Hertford. Future Living does amazing work with victims of domestic abuse and their families, and is running Children's Voices, a campaign to highlight the need to hear children and recognise their status as victims. Would my honourable friend agree that this message is particularly important during this crisis, completely in line with the aims of Domestic Abuse Bill? And would she agree to visit Future Living with me when such visits are possible once more?
I would be delighted to, and I very much thank her for her work on the Bill Committee, enabling us to put an amendment down to the bill whereby children are on the face of the Domestic Abuse Bill, reflecting the impact that this abuse has on them.
Thank you. In order to make the necessary arrangements for the next business, I'm only going to suspend